Before starting the story, let us know where you're watching from and what time you're watching. The house at the end of nowhere. The road to the house at the end of nowhere was long and winding, a narrow ribbon of cracked asphalt that seemed to stretch endlessly through a desolate landscape. The trees that lined the road were gnarled and twisted, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers, clawing at the sky. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the only sound was the low, mournful wail of the wind as it swept through the barren fields. Emma had been driving for hours, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles white. She had left the city behind hours ago, and now there was nothing but emptiness all around her. She had never been to this part of the country before, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, that unseen eyes were following her every move. She had come here for a reason, though, a reason that had been gnawing at her for weeks, ever since she had received the letter. It had arrived in a plain white envelope, with no return address, and inside was a single sheet of paper, the words scrawled in a shaky, almost frantic hand. Come to the house at the end of nowhere. You need to know the truth. There was no signature, no explanation, just those few words. But Emma had recognized the handwriting immediately. It was her mother's. Her mother, who had disappeared 10 years ago without a trace. Her mother, who had left behind a grieving family and a mountain of unanswered questions. Her mother, who had been declared dead after years of searching, her case closed, her memory fading into the background of Emma's life. But now, this letter, this impossible letter. Emma had tried to ignore it, to convince herself that it was some kind of cruel joke, a trick played by someone who knew her past. But the words had haunted her, echoing in her mind, refusing to be silenced. And so, against her better judgment, she had come here, to this desolate place, to find the house at the end of nowhere. The road seemed to go on forever, but finally, just as the sun was beginning to set, casting long, dark shadows across the landscape, Emma saw it. The house. It was an old, crumbling structure, its paint peeling, its windows dark and lifeless. It stood alone at the end of the road, surrounded by a sea of dead grass and twisted trees. The air around it seemed to hum with a strange, almost electric energy, and Emma felt a chill run down her spine as she pulled the car to a stop in front of the house. She sat there for a moment, staring at the house, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't want to go inside. Every instinct she had was screaming at her to turn the car around, to drive away and never look back. But she couldn't. She had come this far, and she had to know the truth. Taking a deep breath, Emma stepped out of the car and walked up to the house. The front door was slightly ajar, and she pushed it open, the hinges creaking loudly in the silence. The air inside was thick with dust, and the smell of mildew and decay was overwhelming. The interior of the house was dark, the only light coming from the fading sun outside. The walls were lined with old, faded photographs, their faces blurred and unrecognizable. The furniture was covered in sheets, and the floor was littered with debris, broken glass, shattered picture frames, and what looked like old, yellowed newspapers. Emma stepped further into the house, her footsteps echoing in the silence. She could feel the weight of the house pressing down on her, the air thick with a sense of foreboding. She didn't know what she was looking for, but she knew she had to keep going. She made her way through the house, room by room, each one more decrepit and unsettling than the last. The kitchen was filled with rotting food, the stench almost unbearable. The living room was cluttered with old, broken furniture, the walls covered in strange, almost ritualistic symbols. The bedrooms were empty, their walls stained with what looked like old blood. But it was the basement that caught her attention. The door to the basement was at the end of a long, dark hallway, and it was slightly ajar, just like the front door. Emma hesitated for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest, but she knew she had to go down there. She had to know what was waiting for her. She pushed the door open and stepped onto the staircase, the wood creaking beneath her feet. The air was even colder down here, and the smell of decay was stronger. The only light came from a single, flickering bulb hanging from the ceiling, casting strange, shifting shadows on the walls. At the bottom of the staircase, Emma found herself in a large, dimly lit room. The walls were lined with shelves, each one filled with jars, filled with strange, unidentifiable objects. There were old books scattered across the floor, their pages yellowed and brittle, and in the center of the room was a large, ornate table covered in a thick layer of dust. But it was what was on the table that made Emma's blood run cold. It was a body. A body that had been there for a long time, its skin dried and shriveled, its eyes sunken and lifeless. But despite the decay, Emma could still recognize the face. It was her mother. She stumbled back, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a scream. Her mind was racing, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. Her mother had been dead for years, but here she was, her body preserved in this strange, macabre way. And then she saw the note. It was lying on the table next to her mother's body, the same shaky handwriting as the letter she had received. Emma picked it up with trembling hands and read the words. "I'm sorry, Emma. I tried to protect you, but I couldn't. The house took me, just like it took your father. It will take you too, if you don't leave now. Please go. Forget about me. Forget about this place. It's too late for me, but you can still escape. Go, before it's too late." Emma's hands were shaking so badly, she could barely hold the note. She didn't understand what was happening, but she knew she had to get out of there. She turned and ran back up the staircase, her heart pounding in her chest, the note clutched tightly in her hand. But as she reached the top of the staircase, she heard a low, guttural growl, coming from somewhere deep within the house. She froze, her breath catching in her throat, and then she heard it again, louder this time, closer. She didn't wait to see what it was. She ran through the house, her footsteps echoing in the silence, the growl growing louder and louder behind her. She could feel it chasing her, closing in on her, and she knew she had to get out of there, had to escape before it was too late. She burst through the front door and ran to her car, her hands fumbling with the keys as she tried to unlock the door. The growl was right behind her now, so close she could feel its breath on the back of her neck. She threw the door open and jumped inside, slamming it shut just as something slammed into the side of the car, shaking it violently. Emma didn't look back. She started the car and drove away as fast as she could, the house disappearing in the rearview mirror. She didn't stop until she was miles away, the house and the horrors it contained far behind her. But even as she drove, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, that something was still following her, and she knew, deep down, that she would never be able to escape the house at the end of nowhere. It had taken her mother, and it would take her too, eventually. She just didn't know when. Epilogue. Years later, Emma sat in her small apartment, the note from her mother still clutched in her hand. She had tried to forget about the house, to move on with her life, but it had been impossible. The memories of that night haunted her, the growl echoing in her dreams. The image of her mother's body burned into her mind. And then, one day, she received another letter. It was in the same plain white envelope, with no return address. Her hands trembled as she opened it, and inside was a single sheet of paper, the words scrawled in that same shaky, frantic handwriting. "You shouldn't have come back." Emma's heart stopped. She hadn't gone back. She had never gone back. But as she read the words, she realized the truth. The house had never let her go. It had been watching her, waiting for her, all this time. And now, it was coming for her.